Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I'm here with Professor Naomi Seidman, Professor of Jewish Studies at University of Toronto. Naomi, welcome.
Very happy to be here.
So we were at dinner the other night and you had to rush to catch a flight. But before we did, you had a comment that I wanted to actually dig in on. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. We were talking about non-Orthodox forms of Judaism. And just for a listener's background, both of us grew up Orthodox. Neither of us currently identifies Orthodox. We can probably address that in a couple of minutes. But you had some comment about how coming from an Orthodox background, you can't really take, say, Reform or Reconstructionist Judaism seriously. And I wanted to dig in on that because I think that really does speak to a lot of experience of people leaving the Orthodox community. And oftentimes people are shocked that they don't end up becoming, practicing Reform Jews, but they sort of end up oscillating between Orthodox and secular. So you can either start at that comment, you can give a little bit of background, but I'm excited to dig into this.
Yeah, it's a kind of snobbery, I think, that is linked with growing up Orthodox. That's very much part of Orthodox culture, that we're the people who are doing it right. And you could, and this is real, and we know the rules, and you can leave that world, but I think it's very common to leave the world, but not leave that snobbery behind. Continue to believe on some level that Orthodox Jews have it right and other people don't. And the in my case, it's even like modern Orthodoxy. Who are those people? Like this idea that even they're kind of not right, and which is one, I guess, funny answer to the question of, well, okay, so you're not Orthodox anymore. Why aren't you something else? And part of the answer is because I still, I haven't gotten rid of that Orthodox snobbery. And by the way, when I call it snobbery, it's not necessarily historically so accurate, right? Orthodoxy itself is a kind of product of all kinds of historical developments and doesn't have any kind of absolute claim to authenticity. And I've had to learn all these things, right? So I teach Jewish studies, I teach about the development of Orthodoxy, I write about it, but all those things are kind of intellectual developments in my adulthood that don't necessarily have an impact on that like very deep rooted kind of emotional attitude. By the way, the other funny answer, somewhat funny answer I give to, well, why can't you just be like normal Jewish, whatever the asker thinks normal Jewish is? Or why can't you just be modern Orthodox? Or why can't you just be, when people ask that, the answer I used to give is, I can't afford it. It's Orthodoxy is like not only a religious phenomenon, right? It arrays itself as on some kind of religious spectrum. It's also very closely related to class. And modern Orthodox Jews are, they're not just a little bit less lax, if you want to call it that. And I'm not even sure that that's how modern Orthodox Jews would describe themselves. They tend to be much more successful and richer. And, in my stereotype, they live on the Upper West Side, their kids go to fancy Ivy League schools. I mean, all of that stuff was just totally outside my grasp from a class perspective. So yeah, I can't afford to be any other kind of Jewish. It's either Orthodox or, punk. I mean, I
Orthodox
can't
are
afford it now. I'm a fancy professor, but this was true for a long time.
No, I love it. I think that's a very underrated point. You said a lot. There's a lot that I want to dig on, but let's just start with the last point you made. It is very expensive to live in the modern Orthodox Jewish community. I mean, I grew up in the modern Orthodox Jewish community, and just looking at the array of day schools and summer camps and youth programs such as NCSY, per kid probably about $50,000 to $60,000 a year if your kid is enrolled in all the sort of normative experiences, not to mention the cost of a kosher diet and the cost of, my dad once joked that an Eruv is a magical string that makes the property value go up by 50%, right? And for people who don't get that joke, right, living in a modern Orthodox community tends to be very expensive because it's almost sort of, the class perpetuates itself. In other words, if, 30 years ago, the only modern Orthodox shul in town, which is the case in Orange County, plops down in a certain neighborhood that is obviously of higher class, it's there. And so other people who want to join sort of have to move there. And even
Yeah.
if people are There has been another interesting corollary, which other Orthodox communities such as Chabad popping up, and they are sort of, sprinkled around in more class diverse neighborhoods, which, it'll be interesting to see if that does pull from modern Orthodoxy at all. But I wanted to dig into, just your background and how that turned you into an academic who's interested in studying your background. You went to Beis Yaakov for many years. Beis Yaakov, just for listeners to sort of situate themselves, that is sort of 1 to 1.5 more steps to the right of the way that I grew up in sort of the right wing modern Orthodox community. Tell us about Beis Yaakov and tell us about how you ended up writing. I think it's the de facto biography of the founder of Beis Yaakov.
Well, there is a kind of Orthodox biography of her. I get emails every day from people who are still in going, things like asking me questions about it. So how come everything I ever heard about Sarah Schneer is, you deny? Um, I'll answer your question. So yeah, I went to Beis Yaakov. I went to Beis Yaakov Elementary School, and then I went to Beis Yaakov BYA, Beis Yaakov Academy High School, which was one of 3 high schools that Beis Yaakov Elementary School was the feeder school for. I'm talking about the neighborhood of Borough Park, Brooklyn. And then I went to a slightly more modern, to me, excitingly more modern um, seminary, which is like a post high school girls' school in Jerusalem called Micholah. And then I went back to Brooklyn and went to another Beis Yaakov seminary, evening seminary. And then I left the Orthodox community. And I basically never thought Beis Yaakov was interesting, never occurred to me I would write about it. That whole world made me slightly, I don't know, queasy. And the way I kind of got to writing about Beis Yaakov, and now I'm totally obsessed with Beis Yaakov, was that I was in Poland with a group of my students from where the Graduate Theological Union, which is a mostly Christian divinity school in Berkeley, California. And Beis Yaakov was the furthest thing from my mind. We were there for the festival. And I was in the courtyard of the Ramah Synagogue, which is this, I think, 16th century synagogue in Krakow. And there were a group of Beis Yaakov girls there, which, as a former Beis Yaakov girl myself, I can spot them from a mile off. And I was like, wow, Beis Yaakov girls going to the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow? That's interesting. And I started talking to them, which was brave of me. And I said, since I wasn't identifiable as a frum person, and I said, are you in town for the festival? And they said, no, we're here to um, pray and to at the grave of the woman who started our school system. And I said, to their evident surprise, Sarah Schneer is buried in Krakow. And they looked at me like, you know who Sarah Schneer is? And I thought this was really interesting because I first of all I had sort of forgotten the whole Polish origins of the system, and I was walking back to my hotel and thinking about how interesting it was that these basically teenage girls coming back from seminary in Israel to North America, which is what seminary girls do, and travel through Europe, which I did myself, but not through Poland back in the day. That they're traveling on their own, unchaperoned, as far as I could see, to visit the grave of a woman. And I bumped into the director of the festival, and he said, "How are you enjoying the festival?" And I said, "Do you know that there's these girls who come through Krakow and they go to this grave?" And he said, "No, I didn't know. Maybe give a talk about it at next year's festival." So I spent the year doing research, and then I gave a talk at the next year's festival. And someone sitting in the audience said, "Are you writing a book about this?" And gave me her card. She was the editor of, a press. And so the next thing I knew, I was writing a book about Beis Yaakov, and it's totally changed my life. It's brought me into contact with the Orthodox community again, with my own family in new ways. So, yeah, that's how that happened.
Interesting. There's a couple things, just to lay out. We can see if you agree or disagree with any of these classifications. Within the world of Orthodox biographies, which is a genre, just for listeners that are shocked, there is a type of complete smoothing over of any type of negativity. I mean, there's sort of a joke that, the mainstream Orthodox press will essentially, any rabbi in the last 300 years was ipso facto a saint, right? They never did anything wrong. They were always perfect. There's always this, very funny, whatever the Orthodox standards are of the time the book is being written, past Orthodox figures are seen as keeping that standard, right? So my favorite example is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he was at University of Berlin. This is maybe what, in the 1920s, 1930s, somebody can fact check me there, did not wear a kippah because it was not considered normative in Orthodox German Jewry to wear a kippah out and about, right? This is pretty true across across tradition, right? It's only for a whole variety of other reasons we don't have to get into that now. If you're an Orthodox male, you essentially wear a kippah everywhere, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. So of course they have all these pictures of the Lubavitcher Rebbe hanging out in Berlin in the 1920s and no kippah. And so in all the biographies of him that are produced by Orthodox press, they actually Photoshop a kippah onto his head, which is just, one out of hundreds of examples of the like. Somebody like Sarah Schneerer is even more interesting because from what I know about her, which is, fairly little, although I did get to shock you at dinner when I had heard of her, in a slight way, would you call her a feminist pioneer? I guess I'll give you the argument as to why I've sort of always seen her as a quasi Orthodox feminist pioneer. We can asterisk that a little bit, obviously not talking about the, 20th century feminism of full equality, but essentially within the Eastern European Orthodox community, to the best of my knowledge, there was essentially zero education for females. I'm reminded of the opening song of Fiddler on the Roof, where, the son goes off to cheder and the daughter is, just following around the mom, learning how to, cook and clean and, everything like that. And Sarah Schneerer, who both herself was very interested in, Jewish learning and then setting up this school system that would actually create a norm for, young Orthodox girls in Poland to actually learn. Obviously, in the last 100 years, it's turned much more conservative. But I'm curious, when you conceptualize Sarah Schneerer, is she sort of a feminist icon within, Eastern European Orthodoxy?
Wow, so there's a lot there. Maybe I'll just add to something you said at the beginning, which is this, I forget who it is, I think Otto Rappaport talks about Orthodox history as hagiography with footnotes. Hagiography is like the lives of the saints. And it's very true about Sarah Schneerer. Her image has been, one of the things I did in my book is trace how her story has been managed, curated, censored, rejiggered, in ways that make her a kind of uh, before the fact giving authority to all kinds of changes in the Orthodox community. Like, for instance, in certain segments of the ultra-Orthodox community, women's names and faces are not shown. So there'll be a dinner for Beis Yaakov, and the honorees are Mr. and Mrs., Chaim Goldman, and you won't even hear the woman's name,
Yeah, the sort of
or much
epitome of
less
this.
see her
Sorry
face.
to cut you off. I mean, the epitome of this, just for listeners, because they
Right.
probably, this doesn't usually creep out of the Orthodox community, but during the 2016 presidential election, there was this infamous picture going around of one of the presidential debates between Trump and Clinton's face was completely blurred out, and it was sort of this uproar of, you can't even depict these, two presidential candidates.
And the picture of Obama in the war room, um, at some, I forget, some terror, when Osama bin Laden was captured, they basically cut out Hillary Clinton from the photo, in Der Yid. And what was unusual about this is not that they did this, but that the New York Times found out about it. Like, yeah, we've been doing this for years. And the idea that everything is always the same and we always go according to the same standards, I've seen it in my own family. I remember going to visit my mother and going, how long's it been that there's no photos of women in the newspaper? And my mother's like, no, it's always been like that. Like, this idea of it's always been like that, as if history itself is dangerous, like is a dangerous pursuit. That things change is unacceptable, according to Orthodox ideology. And the email that I got this morning from someone who read something I wrote, was, how can you say that Sarah Schneerer didn't want her photo to be published because she was ashamed of her appearance, and as opposed to because she was modest? So obviously the question of women's modesty is, I think, really detrimental to the Orthodox community today. I'm not the only one who thinks so. There are Orthodox feminists that there's a group called From Women Have Faces that boycott Orthodox publications that don't show women's faces. So the idea that Sarah Schneer was a kind of pioneer in not wanting her face to be shown is an argument that has not only historical bearing, but also intervenes in the cultural politics of Orthodoxy today. And I said, I don't have totally direct evidence. What I'm basing it on is Sarah Schneer's letter to Beis Yaakov newspaper. There were more than one um, that wanted to publish her photo, and I think actually did publish her photo and said, "You did this without my permission. I'm very angry." There wasn't any like modesty. The word modesty did not appear. Oh, I'm not important. And then there's her diary, which goes on for pages about how ugly she is. So and also the evidence that we have many, many, many photos of women in the Beis Yaakov movement in the early years. It's just Sarah Schneer's photo we don't have. So she's not, if she thought it was immodest to have photos of women in general, then that might have shown up somewhere and it didn't. So I was making an argument for this is how to understand Sarah Schneer's objection to being photographed against, the Orthodox consensus of she was so modest. And she's also discussed in various ways in the Orthodox literature as she was so modest when the Beis Yaakov, there was a great groundbreaking, a large groundbreaking ceremony when the seminary building was first being constructed. And in the description of this, the dais is full of these rabbis, and Sarah Schneer modestly is in the crowd. And modestly, despite the fact that she's the one who founded the school system, she's not up on the dais. And this is also evidence of her modesty. And what I said in that case is, it's not evidence of modesty. She wasn't invited to be on the dais. Women were not, if you go and look at 6 other similar events, I mean, there's nothing exactly like that, then you see it's in the rules of the Beis Yaakov that when there's a public event, it has to be sexually segregated. The public speakers are not women. And Sarah Schneer was conforming to someone else's code. How does that constitute modesty? It's outrageous. I don't know if she was upset or whatever, but it has nothing to do with her modesty. So this whole idea of calling Sarah Schneer the most modest woman who ever lived, I mean, she was modest, I'm sure, and she also believed in modesty as a virtue. But discovering in all these places where it's not really relevant is the difference between my book about Sarah Schneer and the previous biography of hers, which was called Carry Me in Your Heart. And supposedly Sarah Schneer said, "You don't need a photo of me, carry me in your heart," like this kind of sepia tone thing that I didn't find evidence that she said, as opposed to the angry letter that I did see. So don't publish my photo without my permission. So I'm part of what my project was to provide a more human portrait of an actual person who founded this school system. And I mean, the most direct evidence of censorship that I found was that we have her Polish language diary, and they published segments of it. And in her Polish language diary, she talks about her first marriage. The story in Beis Yaakov was she was only married for less than a week. Not true. She was married for 4 years and worked really hard to get out of it. Um, you know, Fought to be released from that marriage. She also uh, says that she went to the theater numerous times. I went to the theater with my friends. The theater, her going to the theater was erased. When did she ever go to the theater? She went to like avant-garde sex farces. She went to lectures on birth control and sexual hygiene. She wasn't sure she wanted to be Orthodox. I think that's the most shocking thing in her diary. So none of this is acceptable in the Orthodox world. She's nothing but a saint. She did all this to save the souls of Orthodox girls. In my reading, she did it for herself. She wanted female community. It didn't really exist in the way she wanted. She was jealous. She was male identified. She wanted something that male Hasidim had. She wanted to travel in large groups. She wanted to do it with men and couldn't, or she actually wanted to do it with women. She created these opportunities for women. And what I saw in Krakow of a bunch of girls traveling on their own to a grave in Poland, everybody knows that, the men travel to the graves of the Rebbes. But does anyone know that teenage girls travel to the graves of this woman? Um, I would not be interested in this phenomenon if it was a bunch of girls and the founder of Beis Yaakov was another rabbi who was trying to save their souls. It would be of zero interest to me, and I wouldn't have written a book about it.
Mm. Yeah, there is. So just to highlight for listeners, there's a book that documents, I don't know how much it goes into Beis Yaakov, but it definitely tackles this wider Orthodox phenomena, which is called Changing the Immutable by Mark Shapiro, right? It's a
Yes.
fascinating book because, even just on the topic of not having pictures of women in publications. I mean, he documents that in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you have all these copies of, say, Song of Songs, which were, these beautiful calligraphy of almost half-naked women. And these were de facto considered normal in the,
Yeah.
the traditional, again, this is pre-Orthodoxy, but in the de facto Orthodox Jewish community. And it really isn't until the last 150 years that the community's moved so much more conservative in terms of all of that. There's an interesting
No, this
phenomenon.
is 40 years we're talking about.
Oh, even that recent?
Oh, the Orthodox community is dramatically changing since I was part of them. So we're talking about, a matter of decades in which the whole past has to be revised to conform with the pieties of the present.
Interesting. Yeah. Got it. I had my time frame wrong. There is another phenomenon, and there's a grad student at UCI. I'll give her a shout out, Maddie Hurst, who sort of attuned me to a lot of these subtle nuances, which is there seems to be two ways that traditional Judaism deals with larger than life female figures. And I'm curious to bounce this thesis off of you, right? You have, right, we'll just pick, probably two of the most famous Jewish women in the last 3,000 years, right? So one is Deborah, the judge prophetess in the Bible, and the other is Bruriah, the sort of Talmudic savant, right? So Deborah, the rabbis throughout the Talmud and Midrash essentially make her into what you seem to be classifying Sarah Schneer as, meaning she was super modest and super pious, and she actually needed, these strong men to actually carry out, the real work, and she sat outside by a tree because she was so modest she didn't want to be secluded with men, right? Sort of this revisionist history of her from probably, assuming she was a historically accurate figure, which is probably another question for the ancient historians, but let's take that at face value. I'm sure if you met Deborah the prophetess, she was not, dressing modestly and refusing to seclude herself with males and everything, right? She seems like a
She
very
was a general. She
she
was
was
a
a
warrior.
general, exactly, right? So she gets the sort of historic sanitization that it seems like Sarah Schneer is getting. On the other hand, somebody like Bruriah, just to introduce her for listeners, she's, the wife of Rabbi Meir, who was one of the, say, top sages of the Mishnah. And she's depicted as being, again, this very wise woman who, had this encyclopedic memory of Jewish texts, and she's oftentimes coming into debates with rabbis and actually winning these debates. But then later on in the medieval tradition, especially the medieval French tradition, which was a lot more, again, conservative, lowercase c, they actually, kind of dragged her through the mud a little bit. I mean, Rashi, the French medieval sage, has this sort of infamous commentary where he says at the end of her life, Bruriah actually committed adultery and ran off with one of her husband's students. And, this is why, essentially she was erased from most narratives. And, taking this woman who I'm sure was probably one of the, most pious scholarly people. And, so it either seems to go in one of two directions. Either if there's an outstanding female, it's either
The
she was
virgin whore
it,
dichotomy. Turns out Jews
yeah,
do it too.
yeah, 100%. So I guess I'm getting at when the
Except now
Orthodox.
we got it something else. Now we got queer.
Okay, say more.
So I think Sarah Schneer was hold on one second. I'm sorry, could you so Sarah Schneer, I think in some ways could be called queer. I mean, I don't know, not in terms of her sexual orientation. I'm not making any claims to know what her, who she was attracted to. She was queer in the sense of, sorry about my very non-Orthodox doggies. Um,
That's
So,
another thing. I just want to highlight that comment because this is not true in the modern Orthodox community. But one of the big differences between modern Orthodox and mainstream Orthodox is Orthodox Jews don't have dogs. Could you, not to totally derail you, I do want to get back to this point, but
so I,
just
yeah, I grew up terrified of dogs. I don't know about you, but like we would walk by a dog. Dogs were associated with non-Jews and anti-Semitism and Nazis. And there's a passage in the story of Exodus in the Bible, and the dogs did not sharpen their tongues against the Jews leaving Egypt. And I would say that over and over under my breath as I walked by the dogs. That was the magical formula to save you from anti-Semitic non-Jewish dogs. So that was my joke, that I'm so non-Jewish now that I have a dog, which is not just my joke. It's like Max Weinrath, Freud's Yiddish translator, said, if you want to know how Jewish the children of Eastern European immigrants are, the ones in America, don't ask them if they still speak Yiddish. Ask them if they're afraid of dogs. If they're afraid of dogs, Jewishness is alive and well in them. Anyway, so that's our by the way about my other project about psychoanalysis and the Jewish psyche, and fear of dogs is a big part of that project. Um, Back to what were you asking me? Oh,
yeah, Sarshneer,
the
queer.
Sarshner
Yeah.
as queer. So queerness is kind of interesting in this case because a lot of things that seem pious from a different angle seem queer. Like the big example I can give is that, and people may be surprised if they don't know Beis Yaakov, they might be surprised that I've already mentioned that Sarah Schneer loved the theater and went to the theater all the time. Beis Yaakov in general as a culture is theater crazy. I mean, I'm not saying these are good plays, but if you're a Beis Yaakov student, did you know this, Danny? You
I
look
didn't
surprised.
know that. I would actually have assumed the opposite. I mean, I'm going to assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but in normal Beis Yaakov culture, you're not allowed to go to movies. And I imagine that would
No,
have
I'm not
translated.
talking about going to movies. I'm talking about putting on your own shows.
I see. Okay. So no, I did not know that.
So Sarah Schneer herself wrote a few plays, including one called Yehudis, Judith, about another, let's call her badass woman. Um, Plays were a big part of Beis Yaakov culture from pretty much the founding until today, talking about elaborate productions, multiple stages and sound effects, and a finale where every girl in the senior class gets to sing, and um, you know, uh, rehearsals for months and months. This
I did
is
not know any of that. And just to spell out the obvious that, for listeners, no men are ever going to see these plays. This is
That's
only
right.
for, yeah.
That's part of what makes it so queer. So all the parts are played by girls and women. Sometimes men are not supposed to even see these plays unless they have a special permission to be like the lighting engineer or something like that. Every once in a while that some man will be in it. And now there are films, so Beis Yaakov films that are made over the course of the summer, elaborate films. Um, the posters don't show women's faces, but all the parts they're either set in all female environments or they're full of cross dressing. So all the male parts, and very often Beis Yaakov actually preferred plays that were full of male characters. I think because the girls really enjoyed cross-dressing. So, there's Joseph and His Brothers was a very popular play. There's another play I've seen, Cantonists, about um, boys being drafted into the Tsarist army. Um, so these are plays with many, many girls dressed like boys. And I found so much about this in the Jewish press of the interwar period in Poland, because this was so fascinating to secular Jews too. And one of the stories I found a few different versions of was that you'd have a play where all the Beis Yaakov girls and secular families would send their daughters to Beis Yaakov if the daughters liked theater, because it was well known that you spend a lot of time in plays. So you'd have a stage full of girls wearing beards, And then because it was strictly forbidden for boys to see these plays, according to the Aguda, the organized Orthodox community, they sometimes would position these Hasidic guards at the door to make sure that no boys went in. And at one play, this one was The Binding of Isaac, a bunch of cross-dressed boys
Hmm.
managed to sneak into the play, and then the Hasidim, who were the guards, also snuck into the play, and somebody didn't sneak in, just gave themselves the right of their position to go sit in the first row and enjoy the play. And somebody called the rabbi of the play of the town, and the rabbi showed up, and a bunch of the boys had barricaded themselves in the women's section of the movie theater. They rented out a movie theater. I told you these are elaborate productions, with posters and all that, and ticket sellers and guards. And the rabbi was like screaming from the bottom floor to the top floor that the boys had to come down, otherwise, their lives would be ruined. And so I saw at least two different versions of this particular story. So the boys did not have these opportunities. There was no similar theater culture. There was like the Purim but that was a much less professionalized, ambitious set of phenomenon. And they were jealous.
Hmm.
um, Sarah Schneer created a culture that made boys, Sarah Schneer, who was herself overtly jealous of Hasidic male culture, travel and, going to the courts and all that. Um, she created a culture that made boys jealous and that involved on both sides of the equation cross-dressing. So this is how piety, right? The rules against mixing of the sexes, created a queer phenomenon. So there's something about ultra Orthodox culture which is both very sexually repressive and extremely queer. And
Hmm.
Sarah Schneer herself is somehow in that mix as a woman who was treated like a man. Hasidic Rebbe stood up when she walked into the room. She her one of her slogans, she had all these slogans that she was famous for. In the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avos, it says, in the Ethics of the Fathers, it says, in a place where there are no men, try to be a man, which means in the place where there's no moral people, try to be moral. In Beis Yaakov, it means in a place where there are no actual men, a woman should also try to be a man. That was one of Sarah Schneer's slogans.
That's really interesting. There's two completely different things that popped into my head, so I'll say both of them, then we can see what gets a response. One is in the early 19th century, also in Eastern Europe, there was another, I'll call it strange phenomenon. A woman who was donned, the Maiden of Ludmir. Her real name, I think, was like Hannah Werner Verberbacher.
Verbermacher.
Yeah, I'm gonna, too many chaz there. And she was essentially a female Hasidic Rebbe. I mean, she had all the normal things that a Hasidic Rebbe did. I mean, she taught males from behind, a cloth, of course, because of the modesty. She would, engage in the classic, tish, where she, one of the things that happens at a Hasidic tish is, the Rebbe will eat from a piece of challah and then pass around bits of that challah to everybody. She did that. And there's also some interesting history on her where some speculate that she was gender bending a little bit. I have heard some, scholarship talk about queerness. Again, I don't think in the sense of, actual sexual orientation, but just in a lot of what you're talking about. So that's one thing that pops into mind. The other, in terms of the ultra Orthodox community, and this is not the case in the modern Orthodox community that I grew up in, where essentially, socially at least, there is egalitarian of genders, right? Religiously, there still isn't, but at least socially and professionally, right? A man in a modern Orthodox community is no more likely to be a lawyer than a female at this point in 2025. But this is obviously not the case in the ultra Orthodox community. But I was in Israel about 2 years ago, and I was talking to a professor, I'm going to completely forget his name, who was doing sociologic research on the ultra Orthodox community in Israel. And he pointed out that because in the last generation or two, there was such a push of men spending time in Kollel, essentially just studying, Talmud and Gemara all day, obviously, this is one of the big debates in Israel about going to the army, but also, in terms of secular education and even work. For a man, it's considered, bittul Torah, or, nullifying the Torah to any time you're not spending learning Torah, right? So this is also probably why in a lot of yeshivas they're not focused on theater, but even more to the point, it's why you're not going to see a lot of ultra Orthodox Jews go to college and be representative in white collar jobs. But because that doesn't apply to females, you actually have the strange phenomenon now in the Haredi community where there's a higher level of education among women and higher earning potential than men. Which this sociologist put it this way. It was very funny, and he actually was part of the ultra Orthodox community, so he was sort of an insider outsider academic, where he said it's gotten to the point where men in the Kollel coffee room are sharing challah recipes because they've become the de facto, homemakers because their wives are in the high tech sector and they're, going from Bnei Barak every day to Tel Aviv. And so they don't have time to, go shopping and make challah. But the men, what's the difference if you spend an hour less on, learning Talmud? So, this strange switching of genders, it's almost going full circle. I don't know if, this is obviously a little bit of a side, but, those two stories popped into my head.
Oh, totally part of Beis Yaakov is very, very wrapped into this story. This whole every aspect of it, the ability of men to sit and learn, that was engineered by the Beis Yaakov seminary teacher with the oh my God, what's the name of the ultra Orthodox rabbi in Israel, Karelitz, the not oh my God, okay, the name is escaping me, but anyway, the idea that after the Holocaust that men would sit and learn, the that what was required was buy-in from Orthodox women, and Beis Yaakov switched on a dime from emphasizing women's Torah study to emphasizing men's Torah study. And yes, you're right, and also providing income for women, to be able to support their husbands while the husbands sat and learned. That's the phrase that you use for studying Talmud, quote unquote, all day. And Lakewood, which is the main place that this happens in the United States, a yeshiva town, if you want to call it that, in New Jersey, which has, I think, 5,000 students, 8,000 students. There's a joke about Lakewood, which is, what do you call a two-income family in Lakewood? Lesbians.
Lesbian. Okay, I was close. If you give me another second.
You were getting there. So hopefully, even people who don't know what Lakewood is will get that joke after we explained all this.
Well, this is also, it's funny because I was going to say this before, but I've noticed because of, just going back to before Orthodox publications not showing females, it's gotten to the point where I was in Mea Shearim a couple of years ago. I actually, every time I go to Jerusalem for Shabbat with students, which is quite often, I always take them on a side venture to Mea Shearim because it's just such a fascinating. I mean, it's the closest I could imagine. And for, this is sort of ahistorical what I'm about to say, but if you could imagine, I always tell students, if you could imagine stepping into the shtetl in the late 1800s, the closest you can get is probably Mea Shearim on a Friday, evening before Shabbat. So I always take them, and we were looking through, a children's game store. And one of the things that I pointed out to them is on all the covers of the games, normally in America, I don't know, my wife and I just had a baby. So you buy all these baby toys and there's a picture of, a happy family playing with the children. And, stereotypically, it's obviously, heteronormative. And so you have, a mother and a father and, maybe a dog in the background. And, but in all of these pictures, it was just two guys, playing with the kids. And if you didn't know all of this that we're talking about, it just seemed like this was a Orthodox gay store for, because every single, game, it didn't matter if it was a kid's book or a puzzle or, action
Yeah,
figures. It was just all boys. And, you had these
right,
two fathers sitting down at a Shabbat meal with a bunch of kids. And you're, obviously the subtext is the women are both in the
right.
kitchen and whatever. But if you don't get that
But
and you're
we
just
don't
like,
want to
oh,
have the little mommy dolls. Yeah, Chaim Yankov has two daddies. Um, I remembered the name of the rabbi. I was trying to remember the name of Chazonish. Um, so, in terms of the maid of Ludmir, the maid of Ludmir believed herself to have a male soul or something like that. Sarashnera doesn't go that far, but she comes pretty close. in her, she is, from her diary, it's clear that she's a kind of male identified woman. She's very bored hanging out with other women who talk about things that she considers, empty and frivolous. She admires her Hasidic brother, and she wishes that instead of someone giving her some like fancy shawl for her engagement, that she had gotten, like Svarim, holy books. So she's, I don't know what to call that, exactly. I mean, it's something I relate to. I was very much like that when I was a girl. I was, you know, uninterested in the girl things that we were supposed to be interested in. So that's one thing. The other thing about her is that you said, which is this kind of weird way in which extreme sexual segregation produces queer phenomena, including gay love. Like we have the diary of someone from the seminary and into our period, and she talks about all the dramatic crushes and how she almost faints when she dances with one of the you know other students that she has a crush on. um I mean, that's sort of it's well known from the it's actually, people think about queer culture as being a phenomenon that's associated with the left and with sexual liberties, etc. But it should also, or it is also associated with, let's say, extreme religious groups or the army or the church or the priests, or you get a very sexually charged homosocial, let's call it a homosocial environment, like a purely girls. And Beis Yaakov was certainly like that. You asked me earlier about whether this is feminism or not. And I don't take, by the way, I don't take a stand on that question. I consider it kind of respectful for people to allow to make their own ideological identifications. But I did note that there was and sometimes say, oh, feminism wasn't a thing in that period. It certainly was. There were women's uh, newspapers and conferences and organizations into our period doing things that could only be, there were, people talk about, and women's vote was up for grabs, suffrage. Um, the aguna, what's called the aguna problem, women who are religiously chained to absent husbands or husbands that won't give them an official religious divorce. So those were live issues at the time. And Sarah Schneer weighed in on a lot of these questions and took a stance. And at one point, she complained that Orthodox women were not being sufficiently included in these women's conferences. So that gives some clue that she herself, other than the fact that she spoke in such clearly, tones that register as feminist, to me at least, when she gave a speech at the opening of the founding conference of Neshei Agudas Yisrael, the women's movement of the organized Orthodox community. She said, it's time for Orthodox Jewish women to step forth on the world stage. She didn't use the word feminism. I mean, it wasn't really, that particular word wasn't in use at the time. But to me, that sounds very much like a kind of feminist call to arms. So, on the other hand, she was also like the kind of feminist who is, interested in being one of the men. Very kind of painful when you read her diary about feeling excluded from male, from the kind of positions of visibility and power that she really deserved, given, the incredible contribution she was making to Orthodoxy. And yet she, as people said in the eulogies, she accepted that if she was going to be who she was in the Orthodox world, she wouldn't be up on the days. She wouldn't be invited to male conferences. She would only go, she wasn't invited to the Hasidic court as a female, as a member of a Belzer family. She was only invited as a kind of, ambassador from the world of Orthodox politics. So these are things that, that's how she got accepted. And when they couldn't live without her, and they tried to live without her. I mean, one of the more shocking things I uncovered in my book is that everybody knows that Beis Yaakov was taken over by the Aguda in 1925. Officially earlier, but they didn't really do anything about it until 1925. And one of the things I discovered is that they actually tried to kick her out of the movement. They tried to take it over. They moved the head office from Krakow to Warsaw. And they moved the girls that she was living with. She was living with these teenage girls. I always wonder whether I should say young women, but I sort of use Beis Yaakov usage, in which you're a Beis Yaakov girl till till you die. She took the girls out of her daughters, quote unquote. They took the girls out of the apartment that they were living in with her, and they moved them to another apartment many blocks away. She followed the girls. There ended up being two offices, her office in Krakow and the office in Warsaw. She just wouldn't let them take it away. And they tried to, like, for a year, her name was barely mentioned in the opening. It was one of the founding documents of the Aguda. The only mention of Sarah Schneer is, we need to professionalize and get past Sarah Schneer's educational methods. That's the only mention of the woman who at that point had founded 44 schools.
Well, I want to fast forward, 100 years to the present, and you know, it's interesting because in the modern Orthodox community, it seems like the trends are the other way, where feminism in the modern Orthodox community has sort of grown at a pace where you know there's all the big culture wars, I think, on the liberal side of the Orthodox community are over this question, right? So if you're are in the weeds of the inside baseball of modern Orthodoxy, obviously the big question of the last 15, 20 years is female ordination, right? You have all of these different programs, and some facet of the modern Orthodox community is lauding this and some facet is pushing against it, but it's sort of moving more in the direction that you would expect, because again, the modern Orthodox community, I always say, for a lot of reasons, sort of tries to exist in a paradox. But one of the social paradoxes is this phenomenon where, I mean, you'll have, I'll take my wife, for example. I mean, she's, a surgeon, and then, to think, if you step into synagogue and someone say, "Oh no, sorry, you're not allowed to read that in front of the congregation because it would be an embarrassment," which is what traditional sources say about why, say, a woman can't read, I don't know, certain text in front of the community. It's embarrassing, right? It shows the community, the men aren't knowledgeable enough, right? Those social arguments sort of, are almost laughable, at best in the modern Orthodox community. So the trend is changing there. In the ultra Orthodox community, I'm sort of getting mixed reviews from my, outside status of armchair, sociologist, which is, on the one hand, you do see, what I mentioned before about this, push, and women are, entering the workforce at much higher. But on the other hand, and I assume this is also a last 30 or 40-year phenomenon, but you can tell me if I'm wrong on either angle, the gender segregation, and even, the last time I went to Israel, it wasn't Mea Shearim, but it was another neighborhood in Jerusalem, I forgot where, and the amount of covered upness, I don't know, there's probably a better word, that, young Orthodox girls wore. I mean, it was beyond the, long sleeves that cover your, wrist and collarbone. It was almost, covering their face. And, there's been some, crazes. This is not the norm in the Haredi community, but, actually people wearing veils. And it seems like, there are trends moving in that direction as well. So what are the current, I guess, contours and conversations within the Orthodox community now, about, in terms of all that?
Hey, dudes, quiet. Um, Sorry. So what's interesting, I'll just talk about this a little bit in terms of Sarah Schneerer. So one of the interesting things about this debate, or these tensions around women and their public roles, which, yeah, it's the same paradox in the ultra Orthodox community. My niece is a professor of electrical engineering at NYU, my Haredi niece, if you can call it that. And at my mother's funeral last year, there were no women who spoke. Um, and my niece is very involved in teaching STEM to girls, like this push to bring more girls into STEM. And when I said, how did, did it bother you that no women spoke at my mother's funeral? It was the son-in-law, the grandson-in-law, it was just all the men and these very accomplished women who are outright feminists in their work life, just accept that, this is the way it has to be. She's like, no, it didn't bother me. Which is the kind of cognitive dissonance of being, that's created by, or you could call it the queerness, maybe, of of being a woman, an ultra-Orthodox woman in the yeshivish world, which is different from the Hasidic world that is more the way I grew up. Um, but that was like a side note to remind me of your question again.
I guess the question was just
Oh,
to,
oh yeah, I
yeah, better
remember.
understand
So Sarah
orthodoxy now.
Schneer, as so one of the arguments is, so one of the things that you may not know, but maybe you do, is that modern Orthodox women, when they try to make arguments for the legitimacy of whatever push they're doing, of Torah study, of women's prayer circles, of ordination, all that stuff, they often invoke Sarah Schneer. Look at this ultra Orthodox woman, and she's a feminist, and the Orthodox world has pushed back strongly against any such uses of Sarah Schneer, which is why someone like me, a secular ex-Orthodox woman, is so suspect when I write a book about Sarah Schneer. And my mother says, "Are you going to say she was a feminist?" When I was writing the book, um, which is one reason I didn't want to involve myself in these fights. They call it Beis Yaakov, Sarah Schneer and Beis Yaakov revisionism, the idea that Beis Yaakov was a feminist phenomenon. So Sarah Schneer is at the, this question of whether women, on the other hand, the same sorts of things are happening within the ultra Orthodox world, or very similar ones. So for instance, um, there's ultra Orthodox women's political organization in Israel called something like Harediot, or which calls for the representation of women in the organized ultra Orthodox world. So, rabbinical councils and things like that. And they, on their logo, is a drawing of Sarah Schneer. So it's like, Harediot, and there's Sarah Schneer, and they sell T-shirts on their website with Sarah Schneer on them. So, and there are also women fighting to study Talmud in the Beis Yaakov world. As I said, there's a Beis Yaakov principal who started an organization called, or Beis Yaakov Style Teachers College. She's the dean of it. She started an organization called From Women Have Faces, which is a boycott of Haredi press that doesn't include women's faces. So there's certainly, thank God, that there's a feminist counterpart to what's going on in the modern Orthodox world, though a lot more embattled, and I think with the more difficult job. And Sarah Schneer is certainly, the absolute hero of these women. I didn't say, but I'm making a documentary film based on my book, and the opening shot of our trailer, as it exists so far, is the first um, protest against sexual abuse in a Beis Yaakov school, sexual abuse by a female principal. And the girls who are masked, they're wearing masks over their faces because of the danger, the risk that they're doing. But one of them takes off her mask and says to my filmmaker friend who's making this film, she says, I have two role models in what I do. The first role model is Martin Luther King, and the second role model is Sarah Schneer. So Sarah Schneer is absolutely being taken. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about Sarah Schneer is how she functions on all sides of this divide. She's the emblem of women should never show their faces, right? Sarah Schneer wouldn't allow her photograph to be taken, and she's the emblem of covering our faces in order to protest sexual abuse. So she does a lot of work for one person who died at the age of 51.
Yeah, you have to be a much larger than life figure to pull that off, right? When you said that, the immediate example that jumped to mind is Rambam or Maimonides, which of course is claimed by every single Jewish. I actually have my student gave this to me after my medieval Jewish philosophy class last year. It's a mug that says, "What would Maimonides do?" Um, but so I get to have this with me every time I'm, anytime I can't think of a good question, I ponder at what would Maimonides do, and it gives me no. But on a serious note, everybody from
Maimonides also famously couldn't exactly speak openly about what he believed and thought.
sure.
Same for Sarashner, absolutely working in code often.
Which is exactly why you get the entire spectrum of, you have the Leo Straussian argument of Maimonides that essentially he was a Spinoza, atheistic figure who, was full Aristotle, but just because he was existing within the confines of the Jewish community, he had to defend Jewish law and he had to defend at least some dogmas that, it would be better if the masses believe this, all the way to the, very conservative reading of Maimonides of, Chabad, and other groups, which is Maimonides' 13 principles of faith is what he absolutely believed, and that is, gospel within the Jewish community. And his book, Guide to the Perplexed, he actually wrote this just in case there were any Jews that were struggling with Aristotle, but, he sort of wrote this from their perspective, and it was not at all what he thought, but he was just engaged in some, active kiruf, similarly to, I can imagine, when
Right.
the Orthodox rabbi shows up with a baseball cap and says, come, we're going to go to a baseball game to spend a fun Sunday, okay, there is an ulterior motive there. It's not that the rabbi, loves taking a bunch of, students to a baseball game. They're probably, that's the end to get them to deeper study. I know we've been talking for a while. Is there anything else we haven't touched on just in the last couple of minutes?
We've touched on every single thing that there is.
There we go. There is nothing left. Well, if people want to learn more, one, definitely they should check out your book on Sarashneer. What's the title of it?
So let me make a plug also for my website.
Sure.
So I have a website called the Beis Yaakov Project, which in which I share all my sources. I write blogs. There are every photograph that I could lay my hands on of Beis Yaakov from the beginning until today. Um, there's also an interactive map which shows the location of somewhat crowdsourced. We're still working on it. It took us 2 years to do it, which you see Beis Yaakov grow over the years, and you see all the places in the world in which there are Beis Yaakovs. I think we counted something like at the present, there's 430 something Beis Yaakov schools in 13 countries. So you can check out our interactive map. The name of my book, I have it here. Here it is. It's based Sarashneer and the Beis Yaakov movement, a revolution in the name of tradition. And it's not only my analysis of the history of the book, it's also a translation of Sarashneer's collected writings, which when they were published in 1933 were called the first Sefer. Sefer is like a religious book that you learn, not just read. The first Sefer ever written by a Jewish woman. So and astonishingly, but somewhat not surprisingly, because of the censorship of the curating of the Sarashneer memory, it's not only no longer in print, but was never translated into English before I translated it. So that's my book, available for sale at Eichler's, I believe.
There we go. That's a very firm bookstore in Brooklyn, for
It's actually a chain at this
a
point,
chain. Okay. Well,
and it's
either way,
online. I don't know.
for
It's also I'm sure it's also on Amazon
I'm
or
sure it is too. For whatever reason, Orange County has not been, I think generally on the, it comes, you get a kosher restaurant before we were talking about that the other night also, but, I think you need at least three kosher restaurants before Eichler is
right.
bothers.
David Myers he grades Jewish cities by how many babkas you can get. And he says he can't live in less than a 5 babka town.
That's really funny. Just the 2-second digression on David Myers. I know I only have about 3 minutes before I need to run to go teach, ironically or not ironically, a class on Jewish law. Um, David Myers, who was, when I was at UCLA, he was one of my advisors when I was in grad school. So he actually studies also ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. And he's also, slightly secular, but he at least said, and I'm kind of curious if this is true for you also, that whenever he shows up to these ultra-Orthodox communities in New York, because he's been working with them for so many years, they know him and they actually trust him. So he'll get, the leaders of this community actually asking him authoritative questions, not on Jewish law, of course, but on like, the sociology or history of their community, which I always thought was stunning because the picture of ultra Orthodox communities that I usually have my, stereotype of is they don't care for any outside knowledge. So who's this, secular, liberal, non-religious academic who's showing
it's an
up?
obsolete stereotype. I can't. I have so many Orthodox Jews reaching out to me, curious about their own history, recognizing that they're not getting the full story from the literature that they're exposed to, um, wanting to communicate with me, fascinated at the existence of a secular professor who knows what Beis Yaakov is and has produced, primary knowledge about it that wasn't available within the world itself. The story I always tell, my mother didn't want me to dedicate the book to her. My mother was a Beis Yaakov teacher. My parents met through Beis Yaakov. And then I gave her a copy of the book. I didn't dedicate it to her. I gave her a copy of the book, and she kept saying, "Get me another one." People keep stealing it, like my, nieces and nephews, and people coming to the house, like, "Whoa, let me look at this book." And then at one point, my mother said, "The Rebbitzin told me she likes your book, so the Rebbitzin likes my book, and suddenly I'm like kosher." But it's a problem. Like you don't necessarily want to be kosher in the Orthodox world if you're trying to write a serious academic book. But maybe I was too careful, so I'm kosher.
Amazing. Well, Naomi, thank you so much for the conversation.
It was so much fun. I hope I get to see you again one of these days
Yes, I'm
for
in.
a very fancy dinner like we had.